So the idea behind this session is just, again, a quick explanation of what I believe is Kanban and what isn't, and why teams do think they want to go into Kanban, and sometimes they go for the wrong reasons. So from my experience so far, I noticed that most teams do go Kanban simply when they believe they can do Scrum. And they assume Kanban is simpler, easier, much less restrictions in it, there's no planning involved in it, and they just want to go Kanban. Personal opinion, and from what I've seen in the years I've done Kanban and Scrum, Kanban is a lot harder than Scrum. Kanban requires a lot more discipline, requires mature teams, requires proper assembly line kind of thinking. So if all of these things are not in place, it's going to be harder for a team to succeed in a Kanban. Most teams do Scrum by removing planning meeting from it, and then actually this is what Kanban is for them. They only see it as just the lack of planning, which is not the case. So one of the things that maybe it is worth mentioning is any team who decides to go Kanban, is the first thing they need to do is to go and ask themselves why they're doing Kanban. If they have never done any of the Agile methodologies before, they didn't follow any of the Agile frameworks before, I would personally not recommend Kanban to be their starting point unless it is really by the book that their team suits Kanban. For example, teams that are really not able to plan, such maybe operations team, production support teams, those can never succeed in doing Scrum because they will never have a backlog to plan for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or however long is their sprint. Those people might actually be able to do something Kanban-ish, but still they will not really succeed to do real Kanban as what Kanban is meant to be. The second thing about Kanban is always remembering that Kanban, Scrum, and many of the other methodologies, they're all Agile based. So all the Agile mindsets, Agile principles, Agile values are still applicable. So if whatever the team decides to do as part of the Kanban approach doesn't really fulfill any of the values or principles of Agile, then they're doing something not really Agile. So they're creating their own framework in that sense. And this is basically the challenges of being Kanban or following Kanban. It's not prescriptive. You can't just go online and get the Kanban guide. There's no definitions of roles, there's no definitions of events, there's no definitions of artifacts. The only thing evolves around creating a workflow, creating a board that actually represents that workflow and do it. That's basically how simple Kanban documentation can be. So in the starting point, I will start by expressing what are the similarities between Scrum and Kanban. So as we mentioned, they're both Agile. So they're Agile lean principles. So they both of them actually use the pull scheduling. Kanban pull scheduling, people can pull as soon as they're running out of work, they pull from the column before it. So whatever their buffer or their to-do list is, they can pull from it. In a Scrum mode, we pull from during planning meetings. So we have a backlog, we have the top of the backlog, we pull items from the backlog and we put them in a sprint. They both have a limit for the work in progress. So Kanban has the work in progress limit on a column level or a status level in the workflow. In Scrum, the intent of the sprint to be protected is to limit the work in progress during the duration of a sprint. They both have transparency to drive process improvement. So they both actually are meant to have a way for the team to go and continuously improve, to actually reflect. You want to call it retro, call it reflection, call it let's check how things went, call it whatever you want to call it. It's not meant to be the title of the meeting. It's making sure that there is process improvement happening. Both of them focus on delivering things iteratively and early and continuously. So they are both on that front. They both focus on delivering things. They are both on self-organized teams. So they are based on teams being self-organized, self-managed, and mature. They require breaking the work into pieces. So there is a work breakdown. And in my beliefs, Scrum is much easier to do work breakdown or work items breakdown than Kanban. And I will explain that in a few seconds. Finally, in both of them, there is a release plan, or we need to continuously keep reflecting on the releases and are we making it are we on track or not. For Scrum teams, we usually use velocity. For Kanban teams, we use either lead time or cycle time, depending on the nature of work of that team. If they have a backlog, cycle time is more appropriate. If they are continuous work requests, then the lead time is more appropriate for them. And I can explain also the difference between lead time and cycle time in a few. So the other thing that we need to understand the differences between the two. So the main differences between them is what allows people to understand should they go Kanban or not. One of the things about Kanban, if you want to imagine a real Kanban process working well, always imagine the assembly line. This is where Kanban started, and that's why Kanban was created. It was created for an assembly line. So an assembly line doesn't really have surprises. Their work is well known, is repetitive, it's the same, that goes from one person to the other, to the other, to the other. So everything should come from one person. That person will do their task on the object they're assembling. Then the assembly line will continue, move the object to the next person. The next person will do whatever they need to do, and so forth until it's done. So when Toyota created Kanban, the intent behind it was to have a way to optimize their process to the max possible. And if you know more about Toyota, you will notice that those people are really innovative in terms of process definitions and process improvements and tweaking, tuning, and enhancing their processes. They also, for example, invented the just-in-time inventory. Toyota don't maintain any inventory items. They don't have it. They have the just-in-time delivery. All of their vendors bring their items to the assembly line when the item is needed on the assembly line. So they don't have any warehouses. So this is an example of an organization that have really take another step in process refinement and improvements. So when this actually applies to a software development team or any kind of team that needs to work on delivering something or some outcomes, the first thing we ask a Kanban team to do is first sit together, discuss what is the workflow that you guys need to actually bring your work from beginning till end. What are the different stages that your work has to go through? In my opinion, if you believe that you have totally different processes or different workflows for your work items, you might be more suitable to be two different teams. It might be. Again, all of that is to be tested, reflected, and see if you want to do it or not. But if half of your work items goes into stage A, B, C, D, and some other of your work items goes A, B, X, Y, Z, then you're not really Kanban. You're not really doing the same workflow for all of your work items. So the intent of doing Kanban might be better suitable for two different assembly lines, two different teams doing two different workflows. Again, this is maybe when we're doing it very philosophically. So if a Kanban team, and let's take a software development team doing it, let's say the different stages of a work item for a normal software development team doing web development, or let's call it web development for the day. So every work item on their backlog, they don't really have a backlog in Kanban, but on their work to be done, has to go in analysis status, then has to go in development status, maybe in testing, then it is done. So let's call these are a very simple workflow. So this is ideally the work stages or the statuses that a Kanban team can actually create on their board. So in order for us to work with the team, the first thing we do is work with the team on defining their workflow. And then once we have the workflow, we can create a Kanban board that actually represents that workflow for them. So once they have those, let's call them 4 columns for now, they should be able to see where the work is at. So the story will actually be first placed on the to-do or these things to be completed. Then when the developers, the people responsible for the analysis or whomever is helping on the analysis will pick it up whenever they have capacity. When they're done, they move it to the next phase and so forth. So the Kanban board represents these different statuses. And there are different ways to optimize the board. The first technique that we usually recommend is having the buffer columns. Okay, so let's assume this is a 3 statuses that we have, the to-do, in analysis, in development. The challenge of if you have your workflow or your board created as such is that when you move something from one column to the other, you're forcing the next person in the assembly line or the next person in the disciplines to actually have an item in progress for them. So if the person doing analysis piece move their work to in dev, as if they're forcing the other team to actually pick this one up. So one of the things we recommend in Kanban boards for a team is to create buffer columns, which means for every status we have the active status, the in progress, and the done part of it. Or if you want to call it the ready for the other team, which means every status by itself will end up having its own virtual to do in progress done. So if we are doing this board in that logic, let's call it in here ready for dev. And then we have in here the in development. So by having these buffer columns, this one is called usually buffer. By creating these buffer columns, the person doing the analysis, once they're done from their job, they just move it that they have finished and it's done from them and it's ready for the other person to pick up. Whenever the team or the people doing the development, they have capacity, they can start pulling. And that will not really mix the message between what is really in development and what's actually ready for development. So in terms of the team's capacity and availability, and if there are people who can pick up the work, there is another technique that is a must in Kanban boards, which is the work in progress limit, which it's one of the most commonly skipped things in a Kanban board. So most teams who do Kanban don't even do this one. And this is actually one of the vital things of a successful Kanban team, is to apply the work in progress limits per column or per status. And the intent behind this one is defining how many items maximum and minimum should be per column. And that will allow us to quickly highlight where are the bottlenecks, how can we tweak and tune the process for it to become more efficient. Do we need to recruit people with a specific skill set for us to actually remove the bottlenecks that we have in our process? Or simply, where does the team needs to shift their attention in order to remove that impediment from their process? So if the team is really cross-functional or can help each other, yep, I can no longer move things forward until I go and remove the road blocker from there. They all shift direction, they help the other people, they move things around, and then they can go back to their part of the assembly line. And this is how it was created by Toyota originally. In Toyota, they had like a string on the assembly line. If any person on the assembly line is blocked, they just pull that one, and everybody will focus their direction to that point of the assembly line, help the person blocked remove their things, finish that piece, and then they can all go smoothly with their assembly line again. So this is how this was created. So the work in progress limit is a very crucial thing, and this is where the team will never figure it out from day one what are the real numbers. They can start maybe by saying, like, let's say per number of individuals for a skill set, this is going to be the work in progress limit, which means one person have one task at a time. Or they can say we're going to have the numbers +1 or the numbers -1, depending how they help each other in working on stories. And it also depends on the nature of work items they have. If each work item is for a single individual is one thing. If their work items are big for multiple people to work on them, they can have a smaller number of work in progress. So it's team by team, and this is when we need the team to decide what's better for them. How does the work in progress limit works, and what are the advantages of it? If you are having a physical board, that needs to be maintained by the team, which means the team needs to pay attention that they have very clear work in progress limits per column. So they put the number in here on top of the column, how many items max should be in it. If you are using a tool, and I'm mainly familiar with Jira and Visual Studio Online, you can put per status or per column what is the work in progress limit. And for example, Jira will not allow you to move anything to that column anymore once it reaches the limit. So going back to the logic of this SWIP thing, the idea behind it is you don't put things in the column once it reaches its limits. So for example, let's say the work in progress limit for ready for dev is 3, 5, whatever. So once you have 5 items in here, even in the buffer there is a whip. The people who are doing analysis, they can no longer finish analysis because this one has reached its limit, which means the development team is running out of capacity to pull work anymore. So they're not able to pull the work. This one has reached the limit. Those people should not be able to finish the work and move it there. It will be stuck with them. And if they are stuck with that, let's say they will keep it and start working on something else, they will eventually reach their limit as well, and they can no longer pull work. So even if they have finished all of these 5, and this team still not able to progress and pick up work from here, then they will stop doing analysis as well. So eventually the bottleneck you will reach a point where the full assembly line is blocked, or it will simply be very slow. So the advantages of WIP is that the team will start building more a team culture. They will start helping each other. If that's not possible because of skill sets that are really special skill set per status, then it will be another sign for stakeholders or management to know which area needs help, either upskilling or recruitment or added resources or something else. Another logic and one of the logic that I like a lot about Kanban is the expedite column or the expedite swim lane. So whenever you are designing a Kanban process or a Kanban board with your team, always recommend to create an expedite swim lane. And I apologize for the pen, but usually I recommend it at the top of the board, but it doesn't really matter where you put it. At the top of the board is more obvious. But the expedite swim lane is meant to be for any urgent work that is coming. Let's say the development team receives a severity 1 production issue. This one will not be following any of these. It will come to the to-do of the expedite, and everything has to go in as quickly as possible. So it means everybody drop everything you're doing, make sure the item on the expedite is moving as fast as possible, then you go back to your normal job. So that's why the expedite column exists. Usually it is meant to be for high severity problems, for really urgent work, and there should be some sort of a guardian and a well-defined rules what is expedite and what isn't. Because if 90% of the work end up to be expedite, we're gonna have the bottleneck on the expedite. And it is very, it's usually doesn't follow the rules of WIP. So expedite doesn't follow the rules of WIP, so it doesn't really add to the limits that we have here. But the only logic behind it is move the item from beginning till end ASAP. So if there is work in expedite, do not work on something else. That's the meaning of it. Once you ship it forward, then you can go back to your business as usual tasks. 1 to 2 items in expedite makes sense. If the team is having 40, 50% or more of their work in expedite, there is an issue in the expedite definition. Usually the common sense of that should never exceed 10 to 15% of the team's work. And it should be well defined what goes there. One of the last things is the task decomposition. And I would say the word and I will look at Darren's face when I'm saying it. Some people like to create subtasks. He's trying not to smile. Or he's moving away. Anyway, so if you are using the logic of breaking down a big story or big work item, user story, into smaller tasks, in Jira world we call it subtask. In Agile methodologies we call the user story and it's broken down into tasks. So call it whatever you want to call it. It's decomposing the work item into smaller pieces. And those smaller pieces are not actually deliverables. They are activities that needs to be completed in order to complete the actual work item or the user story we have. So the idea behind it, if for example the team is picking up large user stories and the team likes to decompose their work into actual list of activities, call them tasks, call them subtasks, call them whatever you want, and there are specialized sub-activities or subtasks or list of things needs to be done, that they will be like, for us to deliver a complete user story, and I'm gonna delete these things for a bit. So let's call it in here, we have a large, sorry for the pen guys, user story. So what the teams can do in this sense is break down the large user story into smaller tasks. And then in this case, the smaller tasks will be actually having their own to-do in progress done. Thank you. So what happens in here for the analysis column, for the analysis status, we will end up having 3 statuses in it. To do, in progress, and done. So each column will be in the same status anyway. And the idea in here, for this story, we need to have 4 subtasks or whatever, that's the problem with the word subtask. Small 4 tasks of different activities that these people needs to do for them to be able to move the full story into ready for development. The advantage of this one, it allows people to start working in parallel where and when applicable. So for example, let's say the analysis team is doing their stuff. They can have few things in here and few things in here, and they're shipping their subtask one at a time. At the other end of the cycle, let's say we have the testers, and the testers did break down their work also into smaller pieces. Let's say one of the activities that the testing team needs to do is preparing a test plan. They can pick up the test plan in parallel while some other stuff are happening in the analysis or maybe in the development. So what we can do in this one is usually we recommend 2 boards, 2 Kanban boards for the team. One board for the team, which is the subtask level, or the one that actually are doing these small activities, and each discipline will have their own items that they will working on. And a one higher level for people tracking the main work in progress is just showing the story or the user story level where it's going into the phases. So the intent behind this one is allowing the team to decompose the large user stories into smaller pieces and allow parallel execution on different disciplines when this is applicable. So if the large items we have can be broken down and the teams would like to break them down, you can create 2 smaller boards or 2 boards separating the actual user stories on the workflow, which will become a very simple Kanban board showing stories moving from one status to the other, which is fine. And then there is a 1 level down board, which usually I might be using a bit of a Jira logic, but the swim lanes are story level. So each swim lane is a story, and then this swim lane has these tasks in it that are in progress, to do in progress done. So it's not to do in progress done per activity, it's to do in progress done. So it's just the checklist of that large item, is it completed or not, and where are we on that? And what happens is when, let's say, the analysis team finishes all of their items, so the analysis team has all of their items here, someone will have to move the actual story to become now ready for development. And then onward and onward and onward. So the idea behind it is we need to maintain 2 actual list of items, the main items which are the user stories and the small items which are the individual activities the teams is performing. And again, this is one way the team can explore or experiment with if they say our items or our work items are very large and cannot be decomposed. Ideally, we recommend the teams to decompose their works into smaller pieces. That's not always applicable, then this is an approach. And in some cases, the teams would like to start having a head start on things before a phase is completed. And usually this is very common with the testing teams who would like to start writing test plans. So if you want to highlight that the team is writing test plans, the only way this can happen if they can actually show that they're doing something somewhere else. Otherwise, they will have to wait, if they want to really respect the process 100%, they will have to wait until it's ready for them to pick it up. This is on the board itself. Now, what are the things that the team has to respect when they're following a Kanban process? The first thing that we need to do is to agree with the team that we place development items or work items in a queue. In some other methodologies, we call it a backlog. Call it whatever you want to call it. So there is a queue of work that usually should be outside the to-do column. Because the to-do column is the work that we want to work on now. It's the next item to be picked up by the assembly line. If you are doing a full software development project, it's impossible for you to actually put everything in that assembly line. It will be a massive board. Either in digital format or a physical format, that will be a very big board. So what you need to do is to maintain a list of things to do as a queue somewhere else. In our terminologies, we use the word backlog. So in Kanban, you can still maintain a backlog. And for those people who use Jira since 7.6, I guess, even in Kanban boards, you can have a backlog. It's just a switch on the Kanban board, enable backlog, and you will have a backlog view for you to maintain backlog separate from the Kanban board. So you can maintain those two things separate, and a status showing something to do is different than a status of backlog, which means this is the list of work that I will eventually need to get into, but this is what my team is focusing on for the next period. So going back to the idea of placing development items in queue, this will allow you to simply have a backlog which needs to be refined. So you can always constantly keep changing that backlog, go and update it, decompose work items. It's just a backlog maintenance, the one we all know of. So Kanban teams are not exempted from backlogs and backlog refinement. They still have that one. The only teams that might be exempted from backlog refinements are usually the severity 1 or L1 production teams, because those people do not maintain a backlog. They need to ship with SLAs and the quickest possible. They don't have a backlog. But everyone else doing actual development or 50-50 or 60-40, they need to maintain a backlog. Second thing that we need to respect is pull work from column to column. So the full logic of actually working in Kanban is pulling the work from the column before you to the column you're in, and then drag it back to the column after. So this is the idea, is if there is work ready for development and I'm someone who actually works on development, I need to pull work into the in-dev. And then once I'm done, I actually move it to the next one. And then someone will pull it from the ready for testing to in testing. Now, if you have the whip and you want to properly enforce it, if the in development, for example, are really fully at their whip and something will be reopened from testing, they need to move something backward. Someone has to bring something back to on hold to bring the open things back. And one of the things we will always recommend to teams is communication. So if the tester will say, I want to reopen something, but I can't drag the item back because you're already at your whip, then guys, who is going to be handing over their item? They drop something and I'm going to bring that work backward. And that's why teams should try their best never to reach their whip. That's why when I mentioned earlier, when teams are doing their work in progress, they usually have the number of team members +1. That's usually the most common strategy, is have the number of your team members in that discipline +1. And that one is the one allowing this flexibility. Third thing that we usually do is daily stand-ups. So there is no surprise, Kanban also have the daily stand-ups. So the same logic we do stand-ups, the same intent is making sure the team is on the same page, everybody knows what's going on, and people are communicating. So it is the same intent of why we have a stand-up in Scrum. Fourth thing that must be in Kanban is measure and report. So from the beginning of any definition of a process, we need to define what are the KPIs we need to track, what are the metrics we need to measure, what are we trying to report on. And usually you make sure that you're capturing this information. One of the most common metrics that needs to be tracked in Kanban is cycle or lead time. So cycle and or lead time, whichever you want to do. Cycle time is the time that an item took from when it was in progress till done. So when the team first picked up that item and started working on it until that item has been completed. Usually normal software development teams use this one as their actual measure. Because assuming a team has a long backlog, only when something is actually picked up for work, they want to know how long it takes them to finish. And one of the things that a cycle time would actually help the team get better is the same intent behind velocity. Personal opinion of why we use velocity is to make sure that the team is predictable. So a team who has a very constant velocity is a predictable team, which means they have good practices in place and they are able to churn the same amount of work almost every sprint. A Kanban team, for them to have the same more or less cycle time for their work items, that means that their work items should be more or less of the same size. If you have one huge work item and then one small work item, you will have a huge variance between your cycle times and the team is never going to be predictable. So if a project manager or a program manager wants to predict how long will it take me to ship my release, they will never be able to actually estimate that one. However, if the team get to the point where their work items are more or less of the same size, then they can use the actual metric of cycle time to calculate how long it will take them to finish a release. And this is one of the reasons I mentioned Kanban is a lot harder than Scrum. So the team that is not able to decompose work to fit in a sprint, how am I gonna be working or expecting them to be able to decompose all the work to be of identical size? That's even a bigger challenge or bigger ask to ask any team to do. Having said that, some teams don't use that metric altogether and they just rely on luck to finish releases on time. Or they can figure it out when they get to it. If we're comparing cycle time to lead time is when the actual work was requested till the time it took to be delivered. Usually this is equivalent to SLA if you have a production support team, or a team that is actively working on customer feedback or customer demand. So this team capturing the lead time instead of the cycle time is more critical, which means the speed to market. How much does it take them to actually deliver an item from being requested to actually in the hands of the customer for them to use it, or a reported bug for it to be actually fixed in production. So those teams, we usually track with them the lead time, not the cycle time. If you are using, again, I might be using Jira again, there is a report in Jira that actually gives you all of that. I will share a link with the group where you can get more information about that report and how to read it. And there are tips and tricks in that page that can help you tune that report for your own use. But again, the main intent of measuring cycle or lead time is to make sure that your team is becoming predictable and to keep fine-tuning your process to help your team become predictable. So that's actually how this works. Same logic behind velocity reporting. Finally, last but not least, is reflect and adapt on regular cycle. So in Scrum, we have the retrospective. Everybody heard of the retrospective in Scrum. In Kanban, we don't have a descriptive meeting. Nobody wrote about what is that meeting. However, being lean/agile and has all the principles, you need to have a forum for the team to reflect, inspect, and adapt. So deciding with the team how often you do that, this is crucial. In Kanban, there are two schools of thought of when you do a retrospective meeting. One of them can be on a regular basis, so the team agrees to do that every fortnight or every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks, whenever they feel like the cadence to be. The second option can be event driven. So some teams decide like we will not do a retrospective until we have that kind of events. So either the event can be when we do a release. So every release we do a retrospective. Some teams would say once our cycle time reach a certain threshold, we're gonna do a retrospective, which means we're getting bad. Or we put a target, when that target, we're meeting that target, we're gonna make a retrospective to inspect it. So it can be event-driven kind of retrospective triggered by something happening, or it can be simply on a normal schedule of 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, whenever the teams feel likes to meet for retrospectives. And basically that's in a nutshell what a Kanban is or a Kanban isn't.